One of the things that I love about the Golf GTI is that when you walk back to one on a cold, wet, miserably grey day, it exudes this sense of well-being. Not too aggressive, not too shouty, just reassuringly solid. It's as welcoming as a faithful Labrador. The only trouble is that in recent years the standard GTI has perhaps lent a little too far in this direction, becoming more of a cosy hatch than a hot hatch. And I think VW knows this, which is why for the Mark 8 it has been very quick to roll out the Clubsport edition.
With the real Golf GTI, please stand up. For a start, this Clubsport just looks so much better, I think, than a standard GTI. It's so much more aggressive, starting with this down here. They've got rid of the fog lights, opened it up on this side, not on that side, but just on this side for more cooling. Then we've got these little flick-ups here. It's just a little thing, but to me it makes the whole front look more angular, more aggressive, more like actually a Huracan Evo rear-wheel drive. As we move down the side of the car, the whole thing sits 15mm lower. That's 10mm lower than GTI, 15mm lower than a standard Mark 8 Golf. Wheels, standard 18-inch Richmond rims, but these are one of two options for 19-inch rims. So these are the Adelaide design. Pure white is the base colour for this, so this is a no-cost option colour. And then we've got the new graphics down the side as well. At the back of the car there is a new rear wing that strikes a great balance between subtle and full Civic Type R. It also adds to the Clubsport's overall reduction in aerodynamic lift. Lower down the tailpipes are oval instead of round and they're pushed slightly wider apart. Under the bonnet, well, it might not look like much, it's a sort of sea of generic black plastic, there's no sort of GTI logos on this squishy black cover either, but it is quite an uplift over the standard GTI. This is still the 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder EA 888 engine here in Evo 4 guise, but it's fed by a larger intercooler. The turbo, which sits at the back down here, is different, so it's gone from a Garrett item to a Continental item. They're also recommending that you run it on 98 RON fuel as opposed to 95 for the standard GTI. The result of all this, well, we're up to 296 brake horsepower and 295 pounds-foot of torque. That's 54 brake horsepower and 22 pounds-foot uplift over the standard GTI. As a result, 0-62, just 5.6 seconds. For reference, the standard GTI only manages to do the same sprint in 6.4 seconds. Anyway, what about the interior? The nice thing is that once you get into here and try and find your way out of the multi-storey car park, they are quite confusing places, aren't they? This still feels like a GTI. It's no stripped out racer despite being a Clubsport. And you get that lovely welcoming feeling in here. There's something I think perhaps to do with all the blue lighting, which I remember I think came in on the Mark IV Golf GTI. There's just something soothing about the atmosphere in here. And now with the sort of ambient lighting you've got in the doors as well, it's just a lovely place to be. I do like this steering wheel. There's kind of a bit of GTI badging down there, nice bit of red chrome, but VW has done good GTI steering wheels ever since the Mark V really, with just that little bit of a flat bottom to it, but they're good to hold. Some of it obviously is generic Mark 8 Golf, and well, I've mentioned it before, so I'm not going to bang on about it too much, but the touchscreens, not the biggest fan of those, and sort of volume controls here. We've got haptic switches on the steering wheel as well, which, I don't know, they sort of work quite well, but I'm not their biggest fan, I have to say. And lights and things like that, it just seems like a layer of complication that's not really needed. It's not an improvement as far as I'm concerned in actual usability. There are some distinctive Clubsport things in here, like the seats. You don't get tartan in here, you get this new art velour covering with the sort of hexagon pattern on the seats and some nice red highlights as well.
One other thing that is sort of Clubsport specific is the gear selector, because this is only available with a 7-speed DSG. And much as the little lever is a touch apologetic, it's still easier than buttons when you need to find reverse.
The menus in these screens are they're reasonably easy to navigate. The actual screen itself is quite a long way away. Unfortunately, they haven't actually changed the graphics on this screen to a Clubsport GTI. It's just a standard GTI, so it's got that same front bumper grille, which is a bit of a shame. You thought they could have done that, really. I do love the screen in here, though. You can change the way that it looks by tapping the view button on the steering wheel here. You can have the two classic dials here, or my favourite, which is a single big central rev counter with a speed in the middle, and then you can configure the ones either side of it. Other things, well, they've also quickened up the steering in here. Not overall, so it's still 2.1 turns lock to lock, but the ratio is now 14:1 either side of the dead ahead, so it just a bit quicker, a bit nippier around the multi-storey car park. Talking of which, I must be able to get out of here soon. Exit.
Because of course, hopefully not all your days in a GTI will be grey and spent in a multi-storey car park.
That's a bit more like it. The thing I really like about Golf GTIs, and it certainly applies to this Clubsport, is the maturity, really, with which they go down the road. They're sort of unflustered, but actually deeply impressive. It just means you can really throw it at corners and bumps, and it remains faithful, so you can really dissect a road.
Of course, there have been some changes over the standard car. At the rear, the Clubsport has new bearings in the dampers, new wheel mounts and newly configured control arms, while at the front, the negative camber has been increased to 1.2 degrees. All of this was overseen by none other than Carsten Schebstadt, a man whose impressive palmares includes the first Ford Focus and the 997 variant of Porsche's GT3.
You can feel the urgency about it. There's a sharpness of response to all your inputs that's really, it definitely just lifts it above the standard GTI quite noticeably. It really does like to rev. Now obviously, as I mentioned, we've got more power and torque in this Clubsport, but also the DSG gearbox, they've given that shorter ratios, which again adds to the keenness of the car. Actually, the paddles on the back of here are better than I remember in the past. Yeah, they're still little plastic items, they're not exactly wonderful, but there's a tactility and a few sort of ribs and just a sort of an indent down there that just make them that little bit nicer to use. The brakes are now bigger 357mm diameter discs. They're also slightly lighter because of the way they're built up, which obviously helps with unsprung mass.
They've also retuned the feel of the brakes, so you don't get that over-sensitive, over-servoed feeling that a lot of VAG products seem to have. And it gives a much nicer, more progressive feel through the pedal travel.
Let's talk about how the traction is managed in this, other than obviously with your right foot. You see, you've got XDS, which is effectively sort of a fake limited slip diff because it uses the brakes to help control traction. But then we have got a proper mechanical limited slip diff, but electronically actuated, and that's the VAQ diff, which I'm a big fan of. It's been in Golf GTIs for quite a while, and it just seems to work really well. It matches the rest of the car in the way that it doesn't instantly sort of grab at the front, it doesn't make it really snatchy through corners, it just gives it smoothness as you apply the power.
Put simply, you can think of the VAQ diff as like a Haldex clutch pack, but applied to the front wheels instead of between the front and rear axles.
With ESC on, you can definitely feel the brakes tweaking at the car. It's pretty good actually, it's not woefully sort of intrusive or anything. But to get the truest feeling of how that VAQ diff works, you do need to go into here, the exterior brakes, ESC system off, that's what we want, confirm. Yeah, simple. In this latest Clubsport, the diff isn't quite as obvious in its deployment. You know it's still there, you know it's still doing its thing because of the way the car's behaving, but you don't get quite as much feedback from it through the steering, you used to sort of get a bit more sense of it sort of ramping up and really sort of tightening. Now on the exit of the corners, you know it's there, but you're not getting as much through the steering, which I think is a bit of a shame, because it was never sort of kicking back through the wheel. It was just gently sort of wriggling and nice to letting you know it was there. The way that the diff behaves changes with the various modes. So we've got the button down here, actually find it. Yep, there we go. We've got Eco, fairly self-explanatory, Comfort, which is a sort of a normal mode, and then Sport and Individual.
The standard GTI does of course get the VAQ diff these days. However, whereas the standard car's Vehicle Dynamics Manager only controls the XDS, the Clubsport's VDM controls both XDS and VAQ. I do love a TLA.
Now I want to talk about the spec of this car, because this is a very early car and it is missing one, possibly two, potentially fairly crucial options. It hasn't got Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2 tyres, which as I say are an option. Apparently you should be able to spec them later on. The other thing that this is missing is DCC, which is Dynamic Chassis Control. We'll come back to what DCC adds in a second. So this car is on passive dampers, which I like. I'm a fan of passive dampers. You know where you are with a car, and I think obviously the setup, whilst it's going to be a bit of a compromise, is pretty good actually.
It's undeniably firmer than some might like for the everyday stuff, but it's not jarring or harsh.
However, I think DCC is, well, I think it's pretty much a must-have option. Firstly, by speccing it, you do get that breadth of ability within the dampers, so you can have that everyday comfort as well as the most focused settings, a bit more firmness when you really want to go on track, for example. You also miss out on, with this, the Nürburgring setting, which was trumpeted an awful lot when they announced this car. The Nürburgring setting is a subset of Sport, actually with slightly softer dampers than in Sport. And yeah, I'm not saying it would necessarily be much better than this, but I think when it's meant to be a standout feature, it's a shame not to have it. In terms of Nürburgring lap times, this is 13 seconds quicker than a standard GTI on Cup 2s, and it's only 5 seconds behind the old Clubsport S, which obviously had no rear seats. I was surprised by how good this Clubsport sounds as well, actually. You can get some nice pops and crackles as well. Interestingly, if you go into the modes and you go into individual and then you choose to spec your various things, there is a chassis option, which would seem odd given that we haven't got adaptive dampers, and there's another option for steering, so it's not that. I think, if I was going to go out on a limb, I think that actually might be the limb slip diff, just changing the settings on that, although there was a separate option for that in the old TCR, so try and find out. When you put it into Sport, I think the front end just feels a little bit more hooked up, just a little bit tighter. I really like this Clubsport. It just strikes a really nice blend of the usable and the aggressive. Is it as good as a Civic Type R? Possibly not, but then you don't have to put up with the Civic Type R's looks. Would I have it over an old 7.5 Golf TCR? I'm not sure I'd be necessarily looking to upgrade from that, because I still think that car is brilliant. You don't have to put up with the touchscreens either. And I think the steering's a little bit better on the old TCR as well. But in terms of this or a standard GTI, it's definitely this.
Yes, at over £37,000, this costs £2,700 more than an equivalent DSG spec standard GTI. But I think the changes more than justify the extra outlay. Why? Because it's good to have a hot hatch that not only feels comforting on the grey days, but also excites you enough to take it out and go for a drive, just because there might be a good sunset.